At dawn, the fields looked like a sea of gold, rippled by a breeze that whispered through the stalks. The light was soft and forgiving, tracing lines across the weathered face of a man who had spent half a century watching the sun rise over the same land. He was Earl Mitchell, and he stood on the edge of the field with his boots planted firmly in the soil his father had once turned with a mule and plow. His hands were rough, calloused from decades of gripping tools, lifting hay bales, and coaxing life from dirt that never gave anything easily. The lines in his palms were like the furrows in his fields, grooves carved by the rhythm of work and the weight of responsibility. In the quiet of morning, before the machinery roared to life and before the demands of the day crowded his thoughts, he took a moment to breathe in the smell of earth and dew. It smelled like history and hope intertwined. This land had been purchased with his father's sweat and sacrifice, and it had fed generations. Earl's faith told him that everything he had was a gift, but the calluses on his hands reminded him that every gift had to be worked for. He remembered being a boy, racing barefoot through these same rows before the corn was knee-high, the soil warm between his toes. Back then, his father's hands had seemed like the strongest thing in the world. Those hands had pulled calves into the world during midnight births, fixed engines that refused to cooperate, and wiped tears from his mother's cheeks when drought threatened to ruin them. When he was old enough to hold a shovel, his father placed it in his hands and told him that he was part of something bigger than himself. It was not just a field, it was heritage. It was a covenant with the land and with the community it fed. Earl did not fully understand it then, but he felt it. Over the years, that feeling deepened into conviction. There were easier ways to live, but none that felt as honest or as rooted in something lasting. As the sun rose higher, the tasks ahead of him lined up like furrows waiting to be planted. The tractor needed a new belt. The fence on the north pasture had a sagging post that a recent storm had loosened. There was a calf that had been slow to feed the night before. He needed to check on it. He would meet his neighbor at the feed store to talk about fuel prices and to trade small favors that kept their operations afloat. There was always something to do, and there was never enough time to do it all. Yet each task was a thread in a tapestry of seasons and cycles that connected him to the farmers who had come before and to the ones who would come after, if any were left to take up the work. He had watched the farmland around his own change hands over the years. Families who could not keep up sold to corporations that saw only numbers on a ledger. Where once there had been kids swinging from barn lofts, there were now fields planted edge to edge with crops managed by satellites. He did not begrudge progress, but he mourned the loss of humanity in it. The dirt under his nails was more than a medium for profit. It was a canvas where faith was painted in furrows and harvests. He believed that the work he did mattered because it fed people, and because it kept a way of life alive. Even on days when the bank account was thin and the tractor refused to cooperate, he felt a responsibility to keep going. His faith was not the loud kind preached from pulpits and megachurches. It was quiet and steady, like the flow of a creek that cut through the back of his property. He prayed in the seat of his tractor with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the horizon. He sang hymns under his breath while milking cows before dawn. He saw sermons in thunderheads that rolled across the plains and in the miracle of seeds turning into food. When a late frost took the early blooms and his wife asked him what they would do, he said that they would trust and work harder. That was faith to him, trusting that the soil would respond to care, trusting that the seasons would turn, trusting that he was part of a story bigger than weather and markets. He scraped mud off his boots on the porch and stepped into his kitchen. The kettle whistled on the stove, and his wife handed him a mug with a smile that had weathered as many storms as the fields outside. They did not need words to understand each other's weariness or determination. Their partnership was a quiet vow renewed every time they walked out the door together, shoulder to shoulder against whatever challenge came next. In a world that often measured success by comfort and ease, they measured theirs by resilience and integrity. calloused hands on cracked kitchen tables held more love than diamonds. This story is not just about a man and his farm. It is about anyone who has ever felt an unbreakable connection to something that requires everything they have and then asks for more. It is about faith that is tested by droughts and strengthened by harvests. It is about dirt that stains and nourishes. It is about hands that become calloused, not because they are unfeeling, but because they have felt so much. As you listen to Earl's story, think about the times you have been tempted to walk away from something hard, and the moments when staying was the more courageous choice. Where are you watching this story from? If stories about perseverance and the dignity of honest work resonate with you, consider joining this community of quiet heroes. This is The Last Farmer, and this is a story about faith, dirt, and calloused hands. At midday, the heat pressed down on the fields, turning the air into something heavy and tangible. Earl's shoulders bore that same weight, not just from the sun, but from the knowledge of all the days behind him and all the work still ahead. The second chapter of his story unfolded in the spaces between the mundane and the miraculous. Every morning he rose before dawn, long before his body was fully ready, because animals did not wait and crops did not pause. The rooster was usually a few minutes late compared to his own internal clock, and by the time the first crow pierced the quiet, Earl was already pulling on his boots. The leather had formed perfectly to the shape of his feet over decades, just as the farm had shaped his character. There was comfort in routine, and there was also challenge. Each day he faced the same chores, but each day they demanded something new from him because the weather, the animals, the markets, and his own aging body never stayed the same. He moved through the barn, checking on the calf that had been slow the night before. He felt its side for warmth, watched its breathing, and waited for the telltale sucking that signaled hunger. The calf's eyes were bright. That was a good sign. He mixed formula, warmed it, and held the bottle while the calf latched on and drank greedily. The animal's strength reminded him of when he had been young, when his own energy had seemed endless. Back then, he could work until midnight, sleep for a few hours, and be ready to go again. There had been nights when he and his wife had danced in the kitchen after finishing chores because the barn roof had held up against a storm or because a neighbor had come through with a lend of a spare part that allowed the tractor to keep running. Those moments of joy had not been the product of ease but of triumph over hardship. When he looked at the calf nursing, he saw more than a future cow. He saw continuity, hope, and the promise that the work he did mattered, beyond his own lifespan. After feeding, he loaded the flatbed with the hay bales to take to the pasture. The bales were heavy, and his back protested with a familiar ache that he had long ago accepted as part of his daily existence. Every scar, every stiff joint, every callus was a reminder of tasks completed. He drove to the north pasture, passing the sagging fence post he planned to fix later. As he rolled over the ruts, he thought about how many times he had traveled this path. He could probably navigate it blindfolded, yet he still looked at it with attention because hidden in familiar landscapes were always new surprises. A gopher hole that could trip a cow, a fallen limb that might tear a tire, or a patch of weeds that signaled soil issues. He met his neighbor at the feed store, a man about 20 years younger who had been one of the few left in their county to take up farming rather than moving to the city. They talked about fuel prices, seed varieties, the weather predictions, and the never-ending tug-of-war with the bank. Their conversation was not idle chat. It was an exchange of information that could mean the difference between making it and not. They traded favors, as farmers do. Earl offered to help repair a combine in exchange for a few hours of labor when it came time to fix the fence. They both knew that the strength of their community lay not in the wealth of any individual farmer, but in the web of support they wove around each other. Driving back home, Earl passed the church where he and his wife had been married. The white wooden building with its simple steeple was small and unassuming, but to Earl it was as grand as any cathedral. He had sat in those pews in times of drought and in times of abundance. He had bowed his head there to give thanks for rain and to plead for mercy when storms threatened. The hymns he hummed while working were ones he had learned within those walls. His faith did not shield him from hardship. It gave him a way to face it. When he felt overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility, he imagined the hands of his father, his grandfather, and all the other farmers who had knelt in those pews before him. He believed that their prayers had mingled with his own and that their strength, though invisible, had not faded entirely. Earl's early years had not been easy. One of his first seasons as head of the farm, a drought stretched on for months. The sky offered clear, relentless sunshine with no hint of mercy. The creek that ran through his property shrank to a trickle, and the ground cracked open in long, jagged lines. He watched corn leaves curl and turn brittle. He tried every trick his father had taught him, timing irrigation carefully, using mulch to preserve moisture, and praying while walking the rows in the cool of evening. Still, some of the crop was lost. He remembered the sick feeling in his stomach when he had to choose which section of the field to let go in order to save the rest. His wife had been the one to remind him that the farm was not just a set of numbers on a spreadsheet, but a living thing that had weathered hard times before. They worked side by side, adjusting expectations, rationing feed, and reaching out to neighbors to trade what they had in abundance for what they lacked. When the rain finally came, it was as if heaven itself had sighed in relief. The droplets hitting the parched soil sounded like applause. In that moment, Earl understood that surviving the drought had not only saved his crop, it had strengthened his marriage, his community, and his faith. Through those challenges, his calloused hands had learned to feel the subtle differences in soil moisture, to sense when a calf was struggling to breathe, to gauge the tightness of a belt just by touch. Those hands had held his newborn children and had also dug graves for animals lost to disease. They had written checks with trembling fingers and had signed loan papers with hope and fear coiled together. The calluses were not just signs of labor, they were a map of his life, each ridge and bump telling a story. He sometimes wondered what his hands would feel like if he had chosen another life, but then he looked at his fields and knew he would not trade those ridges for softness. At the end of each long day, when Earl finally hung his hat on the peg by the door, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The farm had demanded everything from him and had given him so much in return. He was not wealthy by the standards of the world, but he was rich in ways that mattered to him. He had land that had fed his family and his community. He had a wife who stood with him through storms and droughts. He had children who might not have chosen farming, but who carried with them the lessons learned from growing up with dirt under their fingernails. He had a faith that gave meaning to his toil. And he had calloused hands that told a story of decades spent in service to something bigger than himself. As you consider what it means to give your all to a calling, think about the times in your own life when perseverance was your only choice. Share those moments in the comments below. And if you find value in stories of resilience and grace, consider subscribing. Earl's journey continues, and there is much more to learn from faith, dirt, and the strength of calloused hands. The year Earl turned 35, an unexpected storm swept across the plains in late spring, a monstrous wall of dark clouds that turned day into twilight and rattled the farmhouse windows. Weather forecasts then were not as precise as they are now, and the warnings had come too late. Earl had been out in the south pasture mending a gate when he saw the sky change. It was not just the color that alarmed him, but the silence that preceded the roar. Birds went quiet. The wind dropped abruptly. The air thickened like the moment before a deep breath is released. Earl felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had lived in Iowa all his life and had learned to read the clouds, but this formation was unlike anything he had seen. The storm hit with a violence that tested every nail and beam on the farm. Hailstones the size of his knuckles pummeled the crops, shredding leaves and bruising young fruit. Torrents of rain turned the dirt road into a river in minutes. Earl and his wife rushed animals into the barn, their own clothes soaked through, the skin on Earl's hands turning white from the cold. He remembered covering his wife with his own body as they crouched behind a stack of hay bales when the barn doors flew open and the wind tried to suck everything out. When the worst of it passed, he stepped outside into a landscape transformed. The fields were pockmarked with ice, the creek had overflowed its banks, and the roof of the equipment shed lay in the yard. The corn lay flattened in wide swaths. It was one of those moments when despair threatened to take hold. He felt it rise in his chest as he surveyed the damage. It was more than the loss of crops. It was the sense of helplessness that came from standing in front of forces much larger than yourself. But as he picked up twisted sheets of metal and set them aside, he felt something else too. He felt a determination that came from knowing that there was no quitting option. The land had taken the beating, but it was still there. It needed him. In the days that followed, he and his neighbors worked long hours to salvage what they could. They shared equipment, traded labor, and told stories across fences to keep spirits up. There was something sacred in that collective effort. When Earl's tractor broke a tie rod from the strain of pulling debris, his neighbor arrived with a replacement part and refused payment. Earl's wife cooked meals for those who came to help, turning their small kitchen into a sanctuary of warmth and gratitude. They patched roofs, replanted where possible, and did not sleep much. They prayed not for an easier season, but for the strength to face the one they had been given. When Earl's wife whispered a psalm before bed, he felt tears he had been holding back slip down his cheek. He did not think of them as weakness. They were acknowledgement of the weight of stewardship and of the fact that sometimes faith meant working tirelessly while hoping for miracles that looked like tiny, green shoots emerging from battered soil. The storm taught Earl lessons that he carried with him long after the last of the hail melted. He learned to diversify his crops, to prepare for the unexpected with more than just hopes. He invested in stronger structures, reinforced the barn doors, and built relationships with his neighbors that were stronger than the nails holding his fences together. He learned that resilience was not just an internal quality, but also a communal one. One man's grit could not stop a storm, but many hands could rebuild after it. The scars the storm left on the land healed over time, and in their place grew new growth, sometimes even stronger because the hail had thinned the competition. He took that as a metaphor for life. Sometimes the storms that nearly break you remove what is weak so that what remains can flourish. In the midst of that chaotic season, Earl's father's voice echoed in his mind. He remembered a winter evening when he'd been a boy, watching his father repair a plow by lamplight. The metal was cold to the touch, and the oil smelled like comfort. His father had told him that farming was not for the faint of heart, and that the land would test you in every way it could. He had also said that the land would teach you lessons you could not learn anywhere else: patience, humility, and a deep appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things. Earl carried those lessons with him as he rebuilt after the storm. He felt closer to his father during those days than at any time since the old man had passed, because in facing adversity, he was walking the path his father had walked countless times. The storm also revealed the depth of his relationship with his wife. In the worst moments, when debris flew through the air and animals panicked, they moved together as one unit. She anticipated his needs, handed him tools before he asked, and offered words of encouragement when his spirit wavered. He realized then that their marriage was not just a partnership. It was a covenant as sacred as his covenant with the land. They had built a life on faith and dirt, and their calloused hands had grown used to clasping each other's in prayer and in work. After the storm, when he woke early to start repairs, he would find her already up, coffee brewed, lists written, ready to face the day. Her resilience was quiet, but mighty. In the years that followed, when other storms came, some physical, some emotional, he would look back on that spring and remember how they had survived together. On a sunny afternoon weeks later, after much of the damage had been addressed, Earl walked to the highest point on his property and looked out across the fields. The scars were still visible, but so was the new growth. Birds had returned to the trees. The creek sparkled in the sunlight as if it had never overflowed. He took off his hat and wiped his brow with a hand that was rough and scarred but steady. His faith had been tested by the storm, and his faith had been strengthened because of it. He realized that faith was not blind optimism, but a choice to keep working and hoping even when the skies darkened. Dirt was not just what clung to his boots, but what connected him to every other farmer who looked up at a storm cloud and felt the same mix of fear and respect. Calloused hands were not a badge of suffering, but a testament to perseverance. If you have ever stood in the aftermath of a personal storm, surveying damage and wondering if you have the strength to rebuild, know that you are not alone. Earl's story is a reminder that resilience is built one shovel full of dirt at a time, one prayer whispered in the dark, one neighbor's helping hand. Share your own stories of weathering storms, literal or metaphorical, in the comments. And if you find inspiration in tales of endurance and quiet heroism, consider subscribing to join this community of people who believe in faith, dirt, and the unbreakable spirit that calloused hands represent. As the 80s rolled into the 90s, farming in America faced a crisis that ravaged rural communities. Commodity prices fell while interest rates climbed. Banks called in loans, and families were forced off land they had cultivated for generations. Earl felt the tremors of that crisis in his bones. He had always kept meticulous records, a habit taught by his father, but numbers on paper could not fully capture the anxiety of waiting for the mail to see what the bank or the market would demand next. He had a mortgage on his land that seemed manageable when times were good, but as markets shrank, those payments began to feel like an anchor tied to his waist while he tried to swim across a flood-swollen river. Every time he sat down at the kitchen table to balance the checkbook, his wife sat with him, her hand resting on his arm, her silent presence both comforting and heavy. They cut back on everything that was not essential. They repaired equipment themselves rather than buying new parts. They sold off a small piece of acreage that had been uncleared pasture to pay the bank. Earl did not sleep much that year. He would lie awake listening to the rhythmic tick of the clock and the occasional lowing of cattle outside, his mind running through scenarios and contingency plans. The thought of losing the farm was more than fear of financial ruin. It was a fear of losing his identity and his family's legacy. His father had taught him to measure time, not by calendars, but by planting and harvest. His grandparents' photographs hung in the hallway, faces stern and proud, looking out at a world they had helped shape. How could he be the one to let it go? When the bank officer called and suggested a meeting to discuss restructuring his loan, Earl felt his stomach knot. He put on his best shirt and drove into town with his hat in his hands. The bank was a tall brick building with polished floors and quiet halls that swallowed sound. The loan officer smiled politely, but his eyes were distant. Earl explained his situation, his plans to cut costs, his hope that prices would rebound. The officer listened, but his responses were measured and impersonal. He spoke of risks and ratios, of policies set by people far removed from the smell of soil and diesel. Earl felt like a number. He realized then that the bank saw his land not as a living entity, but as collateral. On his way home, he stopped by the church. The sanctuary was empty and cool, the light filtered through stained glass. He sat in the back pew and bowed his head. He did not ask for money. He asked for guidance. He asked for the strength to face whatever outcome was ahead, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to let go. He thought about his children, who were grown and living lives that did not revolve around sunrise chores and crop rotations. He did not want to burden them with his worries, but he also knew that the decision he made would affect them whether he told them or not. He prayed for honesty. When he left the church, he felt no miraculous assurance that everything would be fine, but he did feel calmer. Faith, he realized, was not always about believing that you would get the answer you wanted. Sometimes it was about believing that you would find the courage to face whatever answer you received. Earl decided to seek advice from his community. He attended a meeting at the local extension office where farmers gathered to discuss the crisis. There were men and women there who looked as worn as he felt. Some spoke of leaving the land and finding jobs in town. Others spoke of diversifying their operations, adding livestock or direct sales to their neighbors. The tone of the meeting was a mix of despair and determination. One older farmer stood up and told the group that he had lost his farm in the 70s and had started over on rented land. He spoke about the humiliation he had felt and the freedom that came with realizing that his worth was not tied to the number of acres he owned. His words resonated deeply with Earl. He began to understand that while the land was central to his life, his identity was not solely defined by property lines. Back on his farm, Earl and his wife made a plan. They would talk to their children honestly about the situation. They would scale back on production and explore new ways to bring in income, such as selling produce directly at farmers' markets and offering agritourism experiences. They planted a large garden that summer, not just for themselves, but with the intention of selling at a roadside stand. They invited school groups to visit the farm to learn about soil, animals, and where food came from. Earl discovered that he enjoyed teaching. Watching a child reach down and pull a carrot from the ground with wonder in their eyes reminded him of his own first harvest. It was work, but it was different. It brought new energy and new connections. The income from these ventures was not enough to replace what commodity crops had brought during good years, but it kept them afloat. More importantly, it reminded Earl that his farm could evolve. In time, the market conditions improved. Prices rose, and Earl's careful management and diversification meant he survived when others did not. He grieved for the neighbors who lost their land. He helped some move equipment. He attended auctions where he saw family heirlooms sold to strangers. The crisis left scars, but like the scars from the storm, they became part of the landscape of his life. He understood that the land could be taken, but the lessons it taught him could not. He learned that faith included being willing to adapt and that dirt could be worked in different ways. His calloused hands adjusted from gripping a plow to arranging produce on a stand and handing eggs to customers, but they never stopped working. He realized that dignity came not from the size of his operation, but from the integrity with which he conducted it. Looking back on that period, Earl saw it as a turning point. It forced him to examine what truly mattered. Was it the acreage? Was it the yield? Or was it the sense of purpose that came from feeding people, caring for animals, and living in harmony with the seasons? He chose purpose. He chose to stay, to adapt, to trust that the skills he had honed and the community he belonged to could carry him through uncertainty. If you have faced financial crises or moments when you feared the loss of something precious, perhaps you have felt that same knot in your stomach and the same need for wisdom. Share your experiences in the comments. Tell us about a time when you had to decide whether to fight for something or to let it go. And if hearing about Earl's journey through economic storms resonates with you, please subscribe to join us as we continue to explore how faith, dirt, and calloused hands shape lives. Over time, Earl discovered that the strength of his community lay in shared effort. When outside companies offered to buy the neighborhood farms, he and his neighbors formed a cooperative. By pooling resources and knowledge, they secured better prices, shared equipment, and supported one another through lean years. Earl also opened his gates to teach newcomers the lessons he had learned through seasons of toil. In these exchanges, he saw that wisdom and resilience grew when people worked together. The passage of time brings with it the quiet ache of change. For Earl, the most profound changes were not always found in weather patterns or market fluctuations, but in the lives of his children. They grew up running through the same fields he had, chasing cows and climbing fences. They learned to drive tractors long before they could drive on the highway. They sat at the dinner table while their father talked about yields and their mother planned meals around whatever was ready in the garden. They learned to pray over crops and to appreciate the taste of ripe tomatoes warmed by the sun. But as they reached adulthood, they looked beyond the horizon of their farm. One by one, they left. Earl and his wife had always encouraged their children to pursue their interests. They wanted them to follow their callings, even if those callings led them away from the family farm. Their eldest went to college to study engineering and later moved to a city to work for a technology company. Their daughter married a teacher and settled in a town 2 hours away. Their youngest, who had shown the most interest in farming as a child, joined the military and traveled the world. Each goodbye was both joyous and painful. Earl was proud of their independence and curious about their lives, but he also felt a sense of loss. The farm had been his life, and seeing his children choose different paths made him question what would happen to the land when he could no longer work it. He never pressured them to stay. He remembered his father telling him that the farm was an inheritance and a responsibility, not a prison. Earl believed that each person needed to find their own way. Still, the nights were quiet after the children left. The laughter that had once echoed in the barns and the arguments over whose turn it was to collect eggs were memories that made him smile and sigh. His wife felt it too. She took to writing more letters and sending photos of the farm to the children. They returned for holidays and harvest festivals when they could, and those visits were filled with stories of city life and technology that Earl struggled to grasp. They also often included long walks in the fields where his children would ask about his crops, touch the soil, and remember. Feeling the void of his children's absence, Earl turned his attention to learning new skills. Technology was changing agriculture in ways that fascinated him and made him wary. He'd always relied on his senses to tell him when the soil needed moisture or when a cow was about to calve. Now there were sensors, apps, and drones. His eldest son had once explained to him how satellite imagery could show crop health and moisture levels. Earl listened politely, but could not imagine not walking his fields himself. Yet after the economic crisis, he understood the importance of staying current. He attended workshops on sustainable farming and on the use of new equipment that could reduce labor and increase efficiency. He found that while technology had its place, it did not replace intuition. A sensor could tell him moisture content, but it could not feel the difference between soil warmed by afternoon sun and soil that had been shaded all day. A software program could suggest planting schedules, but it could not see the patterns of birds and insects that he had learned to interpret like a second language. Adapting to new practices like reduced tillage required humility. Earl had been taught to turn the soil deep every autumn, believing that exposed earth was necessary for rest. When he learned that leaving residue on the surface could protect moisture and build organic matter, he was skeptical. He experimented by sowing seeds without plowing on a small plot and monitored the results. Worms thrived, runoff decreased, and the soil retained structure. It felt strange at first not to see furrows, but the healthier ground convinced him that true stewardship sometimes meant changing habits. As he adopted new methods, Earl also found himself in the role of mentor. Younger farmers began visiting him to ask about his experiences. They were eager but inexperienced, having grown up with technology but lacking the depth of knowledge that only seasons of hands-on work could provide. Earl welcomed them. He took them into the fields, showed them how to read the soil, and explained the subtle differences between healthy and stressed plants. He shared stories of past storms, droughts, and triumphs, not to glorify his own perseverance, but to provide context. He encouraged them to blend technology with tradition, to use sensors as tools, not crutches. He told them that farming was as much about character as it was about technique. The calloused hands they would develop, were not just a byproduct of labor, but a symbol of commitment. One young farmer named Josh stood out to Earl. He had inherited a small farm from his grandfather, but had nearly lost it after a few bad seasons. Josh came to Earl, hat in hand, asking for advice. Earl invited him to walk his fields. They talked about soil, seeds, loans, and life. Earl saw in Josh a reflection of his younger self, stubborn, proud, and determined. Over the course of that summer, Earl mentored him, teaching him how to manage his resources, how to read the weather, and how to ask for help without feeling ashamed. Josh, in turn, showed Earl how to use a smartphone app to monitor rain forecasts more precisely, and how to find online communities of farmers sharing real-time advice. Their exchange was a blend of old and new. When Josh's crops improved the following year, he credited Earl's guidance. Earl, however, knew that Josh had done the work. He had simply helped steer him away from some of the pitfalls that he himself had stumbled into decades earlier. Earl's children noticed these changes when they visited. They were surprised to see new equipment and amazed to hear their father talk about soil microbes and carbon sequestration with the same seriousness he had once reserved for predicting storms. They saw how he had opened his land to school groups and how he mentored young farmers. They realized that the farm was evolving, not stuck in time as they had feared. This understanding eased their guilt about leaving. They saw that their father was not clinging to the past, but was building a bridge to the future. They began to contribute in small ways from afar. His eldest son helped set up a website for the farm stand. His daughter designed flyers for farm tours. His youngest sent postcards from overseas with pictures of farms in different climates, reminding Earl that agriculture was a global community. In quiet moments, Earl reflected on the intersection of tradition and innovation. He understood that faith did not require refusing progress. It required discernment. Dirt would always be the foundation, but the tools to work it could change. Calloused hands would still feel the weight of a shovel, but they might also guide a drone. What mattered was not the method, but the intention and the respect for the land. If you have navigated the tension between tradition and change in your own life, perhaps you know the delicate balance between honoring what was and embracing what could be. Share your experiences in the comments. And if Earl's journey of watching his children leave, adapting to new technologies, and mentoring the next generation resonates with you, consider subscribing to continue exploring faith, dirt, and the lessons carved into calloused hands. Life's hardest trials often come from unexpected corners. One autumn, as the leaves turned amber and the air cooled, Earl's wife started to feel unwell. At first, it was fatigue that could be explained by long days and shorter daylight. Then came a persistent cough. They assumed it was a cold or allergies. She insisted on continuing her daily routines. She baked pies for the church sale, fed chickens, and helped with the last of the harvest. But the cough deepened, and she grew pale. Earl suggested a doctor's visit, and she finally agreed. The diagnosis was not what either of them expected. The doctor spoke gently but plainly. She had a form of cancer that had likely been growing silently for some time. The news hit Earl like another of those sudden storms. He felt the world tilt. He had faced hail and drought, market crashes and corporate buyouts. But the thought of losing his partner shook him in ways that the weather never had. Their lives had been interwoven since they were teenagers. She had been his anchor in storms, his counsel in crises, his partner in raising children and crops. Now he had to be hers in a battle they had not prepared for. There were treatments, the doctor explained, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. Each came with challenges and side effects. They listened, held hands, and asked questions. They prayed together in the doctor's office, not for miracles that would defy nature, but for strength to face what lay ahead and for wisdom to make decisions that honored her life and their shared values. Treatment began quickly. Earl drove his wife to appointments in the city, hours away, while the farm awaited his return. The medical staff were kind, but the environment was foreign to him. The machines beeped and hummed with a rhythm different from tractors and milking machines. He sat in hospital waiting rooms surrounded by strangers who were also fighting unseen battles. He filled out forms with calloused fingers that felt clumsy, holding pens, meant for office hands. He read pamphlets about nutrition and side effects. He learned to measure medications instead of feed. He felt helpless watching the woman who had always been strong, now weakened by the very drugs meant to save her. Her hair fell out in clumps. She slept more. She could not stand for long. Yet in her eyes, he saw the same determination she had always shown when the fields flooded or when a newborn calf refused to stand. She was fighting. Back at the farm, there was work that could not wait. Cows needed milking, fences needed checking, equipment needed maintenance. Earl did not want to ask for help, but he had learned through storms and economic crises that pride had no place when lives were at stake. He called on his community. Neighbors showed up without being asked. They milked cows, mended fences, and planted cover crops. They dropped off meals. They drove his truck to the elevator when he could not. One of the young farmers he had mentored took over the morning feedings for weeks. The cooperative arranged for temporary labor. Earl's children returned as often as they could. They called daily. His eldest son arranged for tasks to be managed remotely. His daughter sat with her mother in the hospital when Earl needed to be at the farm. His youngest son, stationed overseas, wrote long letters filled with memories, jokes, and prayers. Through all of this, Earl's faith was tested and deepened. There were nights when he sat by his wife's hospital bed and felt anger, fear, and sorrow wash over him. He questioned why this was happening to them after all they had faced. He wondered what good would come from this suffering. Then his wife would squeeze his hand and whisper that they were blessed to have each other, to have children who loved them, to have a community that held them. She told him that the seasons on a farm taught that death was part of life, that every harvest was followed by winter, and that spring always came again. Her words were not platitudes. They were born of decades of watching life cycles, of burying animals and planting seeds, of trusting that the earth would yield again. Earl listened and felt his anger soften into sadness and acceptance. He realized that faith was not only about believing in good outcomes, but about choosing to see goodness and purpose, even in painful outcomes. As months went by, his wife's treatment ended. The doctors said there was no evidence of disease. She was tired, but she was alive. The land, too, had survived his partial absence. Animals were fed, crops were harvested, fences were maintained. The community had acted as hands and feet when his own were needed elsewhere. The farm, in its way, had also been part of her healing. Sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, she watched the fields change color and felt connected to the rhythms of life and death that she understood intimately. Earl brought her dirt from the garden so she could smell it when she was too weak to walk outside. It grounded her, reminding her that she was part of something bigger. This experience changed Earl. He realized that vulnerability was not weakness. Allowing others to help when he could not carry everything alone was an act of humility and trust. He understood that the calloused hands he had always relied on were also meant to be open, ready to receive. The crisis strengthened their marriage in ways quiet and profound. They spoke more freely about fears and hopes. They planned for a future that recognized the fragility of life and the importance of connection. They decided to travel once she regained strength, to see the ocean she had always dreamed of. They made a pact to say yes more often to moments of joy, like attending their grandchildren's school plays and taking time to sit by the creek without feeling guilty about uncompleted tasks. When his wife returned to church, bald but radiant, the congregation stood and applauded. She and Earl walked down the aisle holding hands, their grip firm despite the months of illness. They sang hymns with voices crackling with emotion. Earl felt gratitude pour through him like sunlight through stained glass. He thanked his community, he thanked God, he thanked the dirt under his nails and the calluses on his hands that had taught him about resilience. He pledged to honor his wife's experience by being more compassionate, more attentive, and more willing to accept help. If you have walked through illness or cared for someone who was ill, you know the profound shifts it brings. Share your story in the comments if you feel called to. And if you find meaning in seeing how faith and community sustained Earl through his wife's illness, consider subscribing. Together, we will continue to explore the power of faith, the grounding of dirt, and the strength of calloused hands that hold on even when the world shakes. Late one winter, a blizzard rolled across the plains that would be remembered for decades. It arrived with little warning and brought with it a fury of snow and wind that obscured everything in white. Earl had been through many snowstorms, but this one came with such speed and intensity that it caught him off guard. He was in the barn checking on expectant ewes when the wind began to howl like a freight train. The temperature dropped abruptly, and snow began to fall sideways, swirling in eddies and piling against doors. Earl's first thought was of the livestock that were still in the pasture, a small group of cattle that had chosen to remain outside despite his earlier attempts to coax them into shelter. He knew that if they remained exposed, they could freeze to death within hours. Without hesitation, he pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and headed out into the storm. The wind cut through his clothing like knives. Snow blinded him, sticking to his eyelashes and skin. He moved slowly, one hand stretched out to feel his way along the fence line. Visibility was reduced to inches. He called to the cattle, hoping the familiar cadence would guide them, but his voice was lost in the roar. He stumbled in drifts that swallowed his legs. Ice formed in his beard. Time seemed to slow. He finally reached the animals huddled against a small clump of trees. Their bodies shook with cold, and their eyes were wide with fear. Earl spoke to them softly, steadying his own breathing. He waved his arms, prodded gently, and turned them toward the barn. They resisted at first, the wind pushing against them, but he persisted. Step by agonizing step, he led them back. Midway, Earl felt a sudden sharp pain in his leg. He had stepped into a hidden hole disguised by snow. His knee twisted. He fell, the wind immediately covering him with snow. He gasped, forcing himself to stand. Pain shot through him, but he gritted his teeth and used the fence to pull himself up. He could not stop. The cattle were moving slowly and his leg throbbed with each step. He dug deep into reserves of strength honed by years of toil. He prayed aloud, not with eloquent words, but with groans and muttered pleas. He thought of his wife in the warm house, unaware of his situation. He thought of his father, who had once told him that sometimes the hardest part of faith was taking another step when everything in you wanted to lie down. After what felt like hours, but was likely minutes, he guided the cattle into the barn. He closed the doors against the wind and collapsed onto a bale of straw, breathing hard, leg pulsing with pain. The inside of the barn was dim and warm by comparison. Animals huddled together, their breath creating small clouds. He checked each cow, then turned his attention to himself. His knee was swelling quickly. He needed to get to the house. He leaned on a pitchfork as a makeshift cane and hobbled through the snow. Each step was a test of will. The storm seemed to push against him, challenging every movement. When he finally reached the back door, his hands shook as he tried to work the latch with fingers numb from cold. He stumbled into the kitchen, snow melting into puddles on the floor. His wife rushed to him, her face etched with worry. She helped him to a chair, removed his boots, and peeled off his wet clothing. She wrapped his knee and made hot tea. The warmth was a balm, but the pain in his leg reminded him of his mortality. The doctor later told him that he had torn ligaments and would need weeks of rest to heal properly. Rest was a foreign concept to Earl. He joked that farmers did not know what sick days were, but the injury forced him to slow down. It was winter when the pace of farm work was slightly less frantic, but animals still needed care. His wife and neighbors stepped in. The young farmer, Josh, came over every morning to feed and check the animals. Earl instructed from the kitchen table. He found himself watching others do the tasks he had done every day for decades. It was both humbling and frustrating. He had to learn to let go, to trust others, and to accept that his value was not solely tied to his physical capability. During those weeks of recovery, Earl sat by the window and watched the snow melt and drip off the eaves. He observed the rhythm of the farm with a perspective he had never had time to notice. He saw the way light moved across the fields at different times of day. He saw how birds sought shelter in particular trees during cold snaps. He heard the sound of the wind without the overlay of tractor engines. He had time to read books he had set aside, to write in a journal, and to reflect on the life he had built. He thought about the importance of resilience, not just in weathering storms, but in recovering from injury and letting others help when needed. He realized that calloused hands could hold open a Bible as well as a shovel. He wrote letters to his children, telling them about the blizzard and about the gratitude he felt for his community. When he finally returned to full strength, it was early spring. The thaw had turned the farm into a patchwork of mud and emerging green. Earl resumed his duties with a new appreciation for his body and its limitations. He modified some of his routines to reduce strain. He invested in a knee brace. He thanked Josh and his neighbors with gifts of meat and vegetables and with hours of work when they needed it. The blizzard and the injury became another story in the tapestry of his life, a reminder that even the strongest among us can be brought low by unseen holes covered by snow. It taught him to look more carefully, to walk more deliberately, and to have contingency plans in place for the unexpected. Earl shared the story of the blizzard at a community gathering. He described the terror of the storm, the pain of injury, and the relief of shelter. He told them that faith had been his compass in the whiteout, guiding him one step at a time. He told them that dirt had been his anchor once the snow melted, reminding him that seasons change and new growth follows the cold. He showed his knee brace and joked that even calloused hands could not fix everything. He encouraged them to look out for each other, especially in winter, and to always check fences and fields before storms. His tale became part of the lore of the community, recounted each winter when the first snowflakes fell. If you have ever faced a situation where injury forced you to slow down and rely on others, share your insights in the comments. And if Earl's blizzard story resonates with you, consider subscribing to our channel to hear more about how faith, dirt, and calloused hands shape the stories of those who refuse to give up. As the calendar pages turned and the years piled up like hay bales in a loft, Earl found himself thinking more often about legacy, not in a grandiose sense of monuments and accolades, but in the quieter context of what he would leave behind and who would carry it. His children had carved out lives away from the farm. They visited and helped when they could, but their callings lay elsewhere. His mentees were enthusiastic, but the decision to take over someone else's land was a complicated one. He wondered who would walk these fields when he no longer could, who would know that the creek turned amber in autumn and that the north pasture always flooded first in spring. He knew he would not live forever, and the thought of his fields growing wild or being plowed by machines devoid of human hands made his heart ache. He began to record his own observations more deliberately. Inspired by his father's journals, he bought a stack of notebooks and set aside time each evening to write. He chronicled weather patterns, decisions, and outcomes. He wrote about the feeling of soil between his fingers, the song of the meadowlark, the taste of tomatoes picked in the heat of summer. He included notes about the cooperative, about the mentoring program, about the blizzard and his knee. He wrote about his wife's illness and recovery, about the way her laugh had sustained him when numbers on a ledger had threatened to crush his spirit. He wrote letters to each of his children to be read after he was gone, telling them how proud he was of their choices and how the farm was always part of their story, even if they lived far away. He encouraged them to listen for the land's wisdom in whatever fields they worked, be they literal or metaphorical. Earl also took steps to secure the physical legacy of his farm. He met with a lawyer to discuss conservation easements. He learned that he could legally protect the land from being sold to developers or corporations while still allowing it to be farmed. He worked with a land trust to craft an agreement that would ensure the property remained an agricultural space managed sustainably. The process required patience and a willingness to navigate legal language that felt foreign to him. He asked questions, took notes, and sought counsel from his cooperative peers. In the end, he signed documents that would limit the profit potential of selling the land in exchange for the certainty that it would not be paved over. He felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that the land he had stewarded would continue to feed and teach others long after he was gone. During this time of reflection, Earl spent more hours at the creek. The creek had been his sanctuary since childhood. It was the place where he had fished with his father, where he had brought his children to skip stones, where he had prayed during droughts, and where he had mourned after storms. He realized that the creek had been a witness to his life. Its water flowed from season to season, constant yet ever-changing. As he sat by its banks, he thought about the seasons of his own life. There had been times of abundance, times of scarcity, times of intense labor, and times of forced rest. He saw that each season had prepared him for the next, that the lessons learned in struggle had given depth to the joys. He smiled at the thought that he could still learn new things even as his hair grayed and his pace slowed. The creek whispered that life was movement and that standing still was not an option. Earl's grandchildren began to visit more frequently. They were small yet, their hands uncalloused, their eyes wide with wonder. He took pleasure in introducing them to the farm. He taught them how to gently pet a calf, how to plant seeds in a straight line, and how to listen for the sound of corn growing on hot nights. He made it a game to search for earthworms and to see who could pick the best apple from the old tree by the barn. He told them stories about their parents as children, about how their father had once tried to ride a pig, about how their mother had braided daisy chains. The grandchildren laughed and asked for more. Earl hoped that even if they did not grow up to be farmers, these memories would root them in the values of hard work, patience, and respect for the land. He wrote these stories down in his journals, imagining them reading about themselves years later, remembering the feel of their small hands in his weathered ones. At church, Earl spoke with his pastor about legacy. The pastor reminded him that legacy was not just material. It was also spiritual and relational. It was found in the people you influenced, the lessons you taught, the kindness you showed. Earl reflected on this. He realized that the mentoring program, the cooperative, the letters he wrote, and the journals he kept were all parts of his legacy. He realized that each handshake at the feed store, each prayer whispered over seeds, each act of encouragement to a struggling neighbor was part of it too. He understood that he did not need to control every outcome. He needed to be faithful in his actions and trust that the seeds he planted, literal and metaphorical, would grow in ways he might not see. Near the end of a long, productive day, Earl sat on his porch with his wife. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. They sipped coffee and watched as shadows lengthened across the fields. They spoke about the day, about the grandchildren, about plans for the upcoming planting. They also sat in comfortable silence, knowing that words were not always necessary. Earl looked at his hands resting on his knees. The calluses were thick, the veins prominent. These hands had planted, harvested, built, repaired, held and comforted. He knew that their time at the helm of the farm was drawing to a close, but he felt peace. He had done what he could to protect the land, to mentor others, to capture his knowledge. He had loved deeply and worked faithfully. He turned to his wife and smiled, gratitude overflowing. If you have ever thought about what you will leave behind, you understand the mixture of hope and responsibility that comes with planning a legacy. Perhaps you have started journals, shared stories, or set up trusts. Perhaps you have wondered if your work will matter to those who come after. Share your reflections in the comments. And if you want to continue journeying with Earl as he contemplates legacy and captures the essence of faith, dirt, and the stories etched into calloused hands, consider subscribing. There is still much to learn and to share. One crisp morning, as the first frost of the season sparkled on the grass, Earl prepared to install a new gate in the south pasture. It was a straightforward task, one he had done countless times, but he took the same care with it as he had with every job. He measured twice, cut once, and selected sturdy hinges. As he lifted the heavy gate into place, his foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden under fallen leaves. The gate, awkward and heavy, shifted suddenly. Earl tried to compensate, but he felt a sharp snap in his shoulder, followed by searing pain. The gate dropped and he fell to the ground, breath stolen from him by the shock. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky, the cold seeping through his coat. He realized he could not move his arm. The pain radiated down his side. He managed to sit up, but the world tilted. He was alone, with no one within shouting distance. After a few minutes, he struggled to his feet and walked slowly to the house, cradling his arm. His wife gasped when she saw him. She insisted on taking him to the hospital. The doctor's verdict, a fractured collarbone and torn ligaments. Earl's heart sank. He had hoped for a simple sprain. The doctor prescribed rest and immobilization. Earl knew what that meant. Weeks of limited use, months until full strength returned. He had faced injuries before, but this one felt different, perhaps because he was older, perhaps because he had been thinking about legacy. He sat in the passenger seat on the drive home, his arm in a sling, and felt frustration, sadness, and fear. What if this injury signaled the beginning of the end of his active farming life? Back at home, he looked at the gate lying unfinished in the pasture. It seemed to mock him. He thought about all the tasks waiting, winterizing equipment, feeding livestock, cleaning barns. He thought about the heavy work of lifting feed bags and bales, tasks he could not do with a broken collarbone. He thought about the cold weather coming and the chores that did not wait for healing bones. He could not imagine watching from the sidelines. He paced, trying to figure out how to do everything with one arm. His wife placed a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder and reminded him that there were people he had helped who were eager to return the favor. She picked up the phone and made calls. Within hours, Josh and other members of the cooperative arrived. They finished the gate, prepared the barns, and organized a chore schedule. They joked that Earl would now get to experience management rather than labor. Their presence lifted his spirits. During the forced rest, Earl's grandson, a teenager with an interest in photography, came to stay for a week. The boy had always enjoyed visiting the farm, but he had never considered farming as a career. Earl saw the visit as an opportunity. He could not demonstrate tasks physically, but he could explain, observe, and discuss. He invited his grandson to join him in the pickup truck. As they drove around the property, they checked fences, monitored the cattle, and watched flocks of migratory birds. Earl narrated his thought process aloud. He explained why he placed the water troughs where he did, why he managed grazing in certain patterns, and how he assessed soil health by looking at plants and digging small holes. His grandson listened, asked questions, and took photos. Earl saw the farm through the lens of his grandson's camera and realized how beautiful it was, even in the starkness of late autumn. One afternoon they sat by the garden, the sun slanting low. Earl asked his grandson about his interests. The boy talked excitedly about photography, about capturing moments and telling stories through images. He said he loved documenting how things changed over time and how light transformed landscapes. Earl nodded, understanding more than his grandson realized. Earl told him that farming was also about observing changes over time, capturing them in memory and adjusting to them. He suggested that his grandson use his photography to tell the story of the farm, the patterns in the soil, the wrinkles on Earl's hands, the frost on the barn window, the steam rising from cattle in the cold. He said that whether his grandson chose to farm or not, he could still be part of the farm's legacy by preserving its story. As his shoulder healed, Earl slowly resumed tasks, starting with light ones. He respected his doctor's instructions, resisting the urge to push beyond his limits. He allowed others to do the heavy lifting. He focused on planning, on making lists, and on advising. He found satisfaction in seeing Josh and other young farmers take on responsibilities and handle them well. He realized that leadership was not just about doing, but about guiding. He saw the seeds he had planted in his mentees, in his cooperative, in his grandchildren, germinate. The pain of not being able to do everything himself softened as he recognized that his value did not diminish with his physical limitations. He could still serve, teach, and inspire. The injury also prompted Earl to have honest conversations with his wife and children about the future of the farm. They discussed timelines, options, and desires. His children expressed gratitude that he had protected the land with conservation easements. They talked about possibly leasing it to one of the cooperative members when Earl could no longer manage it. They explored the idea of converting part of the farm into an educational center for sustainable farming. Earl listened to their ideas with an open mind. He realized that letting go when the time came would not be a failure, but a continuation of stewardship. It would be another chapter in the story, one that he could influence through thoughtful planning. When winter gave way to spring, Earl's shoulder was strong again. He celebrated by walking the entire perimeter of the farm, something he had always loved to do after snow melted. The earth smelled fresh. Shoots of green pushed through brown. He stopped at the gate that had been the scene of his accident and ran his hand over the smooth wood. He felt no resentment toward it. Instead, he felt gratitude. The injury had slowed him, but it had given him time to share with his grandson and to plan for the farm's future. It had forced him to rely on others and to see that his community would not let him fall. It had shown him that his grandson's hands, though not calloused in the same way, could contribute meaningfully to the farm's legacy. Earl shared the story of his accident and the lessons learned at the next cooperative meeting. He admitted that his pride had been bruised more than his shoulder. He encouraged older farmers to reach out to younger ones before injuries forced them to. He encouraged younger farmers to seek out elders, not waiting until necessity made them do so. He reminded everyone that the strength of their community lay in intergenerational collaboration. If you have experienced an accident or injury that changed your perspective, share your story in the comments. And if you want to keep following Earl's journey as he navigates aging, mentorship, and the passing of the torch, consider subscribing. Faith, dirt, and calloused hands continue to offer wisdom no matter how many seasons pass. The final chapter of Earl's story is not about endings, but about continuities. By the time he reached his late 60s, the lines on his face mirrored the furrows in his fields. His back bent slightly under the weight of years, but his gaze remained steady. He woke up every morning, often before dawn, and still found himself drawn to the window to check the color of the sky, the shape of the clouds, the direction of the wind. Habits formed over decades become part of the body's rhythm. The farm had shaped him, and he had shaped the farm. Now, as he walked the familiar paths with a more measured stride, he saw layers of history in every corner. The site of the old barn that had blown down in the storm, the grove of trees he had planted with his children when they were little, the fence line repaired after a summer squall. the garden where his wife had tended herbs and flowers through all her seasons. He had learned that faith, dirt, and calloused hands were more than poetic themes. They were pillars on which entire lives were built. Faith was not a guarantee of easy days. It was a compass that pointed toward hope when the horizon was dark. Dirt was not just a substance to be washed away. It was the medium through which life happened, binding him to the land and to others who understood its worth. Calloused hands were not a sign of being worn down. They were a testament to resilience, to the willingness to work hard for something you love, to the knowledge that strength and gentleness can coexist. He saw these pillars reflected in his community, in the neighbor who dropped everything to help with hay bales, in the young mother who brought casseroles to the farm when his wife was sick, in the children who squealed with delight at pulling carrots from the soil. As Earl reflected on his life, he also thought about his country. He knew that farms like his were the backbone of America, not because they produced the majority of food. Large operations did that, but because they embodied values that were foundational to the nation's identity. Perseverance, independence, cooperation, and humility were not taught in classrooms alone. They were learned through early mornings, late nights, unpredictable weather, and fragile markets. He believed that the future of agriculture and of the values it nurtured depended on people recognizing the dignity of farmers and the importance of the land. He worried about the erosion of rural communities, about young people who never learned where their food came from, about policymakers who saw farmland as nothing more than potential development. But he also felt encouraged by the growth of movements that valued local food, sustainability, and community-supported agriculture. He saw hope in the new faces at his farm days, in the cooperative success, and in the resilience of his neighbors. Earl's story resonated with many because it was both specific and universal. It was specific to the Iowa soil he had walked on his entire life, to the barns he had built, to the people he had loved. But it was universal in its themes of hard work, love, loss, change, and hope. Listeners might never have touched a tractor, but they knew what it felt like to be tested by circumstances beyond their control. They might not have prayed over seeds, but they had prayed over children, jobs, or dreams. They might not have calloused hands, but they had scars from their own battles. Earl's story reminded them that greatness could be found in small acts done faithfully over time, and that true strength often looked like kindness, patience, and the willingness to get back up after being knocked down. As his final harvest season approached, Earl planned a simple celebration to honor the land and the people who had been part of its story. Under a soft autumn sky, neighbors, family, and friends gathered in the barnyard with casseroles and preserves. They ate together, laughed, and listened as Earl spoke from the porch about gratitude and change. His grandson arranged a table filled with photographs from around the farm, close-ups of soil and seeds, portraits of weathered hands and children. People lingered around the images, sharing their own memories and pointing out faces. The day was unpretentious, without speeches or fireworks, but it truly captured everything he loved about farming. Community, shared labor, beauty in the ordinary, and the joy of knowing that the work of many hands continues beyond one lifetime. In the months after the festival, Earl transitioned management of the farm to Josh. They signed papers, shook hands, and shared a long hug. Josh promised to honor the conservation easement, the cooperative, and the mentoring program. He promised to invite Earl for coffee and to ask for advice. Earl promised to let Josh make his own decisions and to offer support without interference. They walked the farm together, with Josh listening to Earl's explanations of each field's quirks. Earl felt a mix of sadness and relief, nostalgia and anticipation. He knew that stepping back did not mean disconnecting. He would still walk the fields, but now with the eyes of an elder rather than the responsibilities of a manager. He would still feel dirt under his nails and calluses on his palms. He would still whisper prayers over seeds, but he would also have time to travel with his wife, to read more, and to watch his grandchildren grow. On one of his first mornings of semi-retirement, Earl sat by the creek with a thermos of coffee. A gentle mist hovered over the water. He thought about all the mornings he had been up before dawn to check animals or machinery. He thought about the times he had sat there exhausted, grieving or celebrating. He thought about the earliest days of his marriage, about the storms, the droughts, the harvests. He felt a profound sense of peace. He knew that his story was not over. It was simply shifting. He knew that he would continue to learn from the land and from the people around him. He knew that faith would still guide him, that dirt would still ground him, and that calloused hands would still be his badge of honor. As you finish listening to Earl's story, take a moment to reflect on your own. Think about the fields you have walked, literal or metaphorical. Think about the storms you have weathered and the hands that have held you up. Think about the legacy you are building and the stories you will leave behind. Share your reflections in the comments. And if Earl's journey through decades of farming has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the strength found in faith, the beauty in dirt, and the power of calloused hands, please subscribe to join our community. Together, we will continue to honor the last farmers, the quiet heroes who refused to let the values that built this country fade away. Welcome to The Last Farmer.